all the way back there. How are you guys tonight? Good. I'm just going to wait until Judith gets back, but in the meantime, I guess I'll introduce myself. For those of you who don't know, I'm Niree. I'm the reading series coordinator. And welcome to the Master of Professional Writing program faculty and student reading event. So we do this monthly reading series where we showcase what our students are working on and what our faculty is working on. So I'm glad to have everybody join us tonight. A few reminders, or one reminder. Please silence your cell phones for the duration of the reading, unless the reader has spoken to you and it has something to do with their piece. Then it's fine. And the restrooms are back there, I believe. Judith's here. Okay, so I wanted a cohesive theme for the readings, and after being in so many classes and workshops in the program, I noticed that most of what we write either reflects on or challenges the traditional notions of sins and virtues. So I picked sins and virtues for all the readings this year, and for this month we have envy and kindness. So I try to find funny quotes about envy and kindness, or funny quotes about sins and virtues, but people aren't really that humorous about it. So the one that I found for this month is Bette Midler said, "The worst part of success is trying to find someone who is happy for you." So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first reader. Fadi Baya is in his second year fiction concentration. His guiltiest pleasure is video games. His favorite sin is lust because it's the most fun. And favorite virtue is temperance because it seems to be the one most lacking in the world. When he was in 6th grade, he was jealous of his friend's shoes. And you may not know that Fadi secretly wishes he could draw well. Ladies and gentlemen, Fadi Baya.
If you can't hear me, just let me know and I'll turn. For 7 years, I worked as a pharmacy tech. 4 of them were spent at a retail pharmacy. 3 were spent at a hospital, and all 7 were spent in utter misery. The tricky thing is that none of your customers are happy. Generally, they're sick. They've just come from the doctor's office. They had a 1 p.m. appointment, waited until 2 to see the doctor, got out of there by 3, and now it's 4, and I've just told them they have to wait another 30 minutes for their medicine. When they aren't sick, they are there for some refill of a prescription for a chronic illness. So yes, they are very unhappy. Well, except for the ones on antidepressants, they're super happy. It wasn't a particularly bad job. I wasn't doing anything demeaning or dirty. In fact, many people would consider it a great job. Decent hours, good pay, full benefits. All I did was basically interpret doctors' crappy handwriting and count pills all day. Oftentimes I would help people who I really wasn't sure were going to make it. Except for a few occasions, I never knew if they did. They would take their medicine and leave, and I'd wonder about them for a while. I think that's what really bothered me. I also hadn't grown out of my childhood ideals. When I grew up, I was going to be somebody. I was going to make a difference, change the world, impact humanity in unforeseen ways like no other human had before. I was going to helm the next great movie of our generation, or write the next New York Times bestseller, or even reinvent the cheeseburger. Instead, I was stuck in a glass box, doing nothing but pill counting, and if I continued on the path laid before me, I would be doing it for the next 45 years. I wanted out and fast. As I began planning what my next moves were going to be, I was also absorbed in my escape from reality. While most people my age were indulging in happy hour, I was locked in my room playing video games. I spent countless hours and dollars on any video game I could find, from old classics like Missile Command, Moon Patrol, and Kaboom, all the way up to modern hits like Call of Duty and Mass Effect. It was around this time I learned that one of the world's largest game companies, for our purposes here I'll call them Avalanche, was located right across the street from the hospital in which I worked. Right across the street. For me, that place was like Disneyland to a 5-year-old. It was like Shangri-La to James Hilton. It was like Toadstool Castle to Super Mario. I began working diligently on my resume, checking their job postings every day, altering it to fit anything they posted. I even applied once to be a QA representative in charge of telephone customer service in Spanish. What? I speak Spanish, I swear. I figured even if I didn't start at the most glamorous position, the bigwigs would definitely see my value very soon, and I would climb up high the corporate ladder in no time. Truthfully, I just wanted to write their stories, but as is the case with most writing jobs, employers want credibility and company experience, whatever. Some weeks passed. I continued working my job at the hospital and played every Avalanche-produced game I could get my hands on. Then, one day while I was busy doing my usual rounds, I noticed a patient walking in who was wearing an Avalanche t-shirt. He was a pretty big guy with glasses, a beard, and one of those faces that made him look like he was always smiling, even when he wasn't. He also had a badge from Avalanche around his neck. He worked there. I met him at a counter and greeted him with, "Nice shirt, you work at Avalanche?" "Oh yeah," he said, looking down at his badge. "I'm a concept artist." Here I was, dropping tablets into amber bottles, medicating the populace, and there he was doing something important. He crafted worlds, people, the lush forests of Amberdon, the icy caverns of the Bitters End Peaks, the blood-stained dungeons of evil archwizard Dalton. He had a hand in all of these things. "Damn, that's awesome. Do you actually paint, or is it digital?" I asked him. "Digital, we use those tablet things, but I always sketch stuff out on paper first." He held up an overly dog-eared notebook that I hadn't noticed before. "Man, I want to work there. Do you have any tips? I'm more into writing, though." "Just keep trying. Send your portfolio every few months. They need people all the time, even if there's no posting for the job you want. Or I could give you my info and you could threaten the CEO for me." "No?" "No." I had forgotten where we were, or why he was there in the first place. Nothing else really mattered. I was going to squeeze this guy for all the information I could get. If I had to steal his badge and infiltrate the company myself, I was going to get my foot in that door, damn it. I hated him, but I liked him. As the line of customers behind him began to grow, I snapped out of my nerd trance and asked him for his prescription. It was for medication to treat epilepsy. "So wait, do you play?" "Not so much anymore." I think he noticed my sudden change in demeanor, because before I could say anything else, he said, "It's okay, you can laugh. I'm a fan of irony, too. It would be like, I don't know, if you suddenly forgot how to count." "Oh, thanks." "Just give me 10 minutes. He took his seat and I got to work. When it was ready, I called him back up to the counter. After we did the usual employee-customer interaction, he nodded his head and told me, "Don't give up. Keep sending in your stuff, and I'm sure I'll see you around." And then he left. I didn't see him at the pharmacy again, and I still haven't landed a job there. But every time I finish one of their games, I search the credits for his name, and still kind of hate him for being in them.
All right, Leonard Pung is in his first year, fiction concentration, also working on a screenwriting minor. His guiltiest pleasure is puns, frequent bad puns. When asked to answer which of the 7 sins and virtues are his favorite, Leonard asks, "There are 7 virtues?" He has always envied people who have steampunk wardrobes. And you may not know that Leonard worked for many years as a whitewater rafting guide. Leonard Pung.
Thank you. I moved down here in August from Northern California. Last year I lived someplace where I had to shovel my way out of the snow several occasions to actually get out of the driveway and go into town and do really critical things like drink coffee and write. So I had to import some weather here, and I chose the Deep South as the source and the flood. This is an excerpt from Crossroads. The water was near the kitchen steps when Harris went to bed. If it kept rising, he figured it would be in the house by dawn. All that afternoon, as the light had slowly failed, He had heard the whoop of sirens as police cars and fire trucks drove up and down the road evacuating residents. At one point, a car's tires crunched on a gravel drive. Footsteps climbed the steps, and a knock echoed across the hardwood floors. "Hello," a voice called, loud in the quiet of the wet afternoon. "Anybody home?" Harris sat in his old craftsman chair and listened, the guitar silent across his lap. Another knock, and the footsteps retreated. A door slammed, an engine revved, and the gravel crunched again. Harris sat and picked at his guitar and listened to the liquid sounds outside. Floodwater rippling past on the riverside of the house, and rainwater pattering on the roof and dripping from the eaves. The sky faded to bruised blues and blacks. The house darkened, and his energy webbed with the last of the light. He decided to forego candles, no reason to draw attention from would-be rescuers, and go to bed. Such commotion over a little water, he thought, as he slipped into sleep, and felt an unaccustomed smile stretch his face. In the dream, he paddled his canoe through water speckled by rain. He glided past truncated trees and telephone poles that stood only 20 feet above the water, their lines swooping down so low he could almost touch them. A guitar lay in front of him, leaning against the prow of the old canoe. Not his, though. This was an old Fender broadcaster, one of the first electrics ever made. The instrument was scarred with years of heavy use, and he knew with perfect dream logic that it was the guitar he had seen when he was working in the mansion. It was the Fender Louis Lanois had played when he recorded his first 3 albums. Harris felt unsurprised to be escorting the instrument across the water. Ahead, he heard a rushing sound. The air shifted, cool and damp, and he shivered. The sound grew louder, but the water was flat, its smoothness broken only by the rain. He paddled on, easing past tree branches that reached out for him and the boat, and coasted into an open area ringed by trees. A flat line half a mile away marked the levee. In the center of the space was the source of the sound. The whirlpool was a smooth cone of water funneling downwards, the water near it smooth, as if drawn taut by its pool. He looked to the side and saw a street sign sticking 2 feet out of the water. He couldn't see what was written on it in the failing light, but he knew he was at the crossroads, and he knew why he had come. Harris woke to the sound of water lapping against the side of the house. The sky was just lightening outside, and the room and furniture were shapes that merely hinted at color. He lay in bed and looked up the barely discernible lines of the roof planks. The air was damp, and the sound of the water promised only trouble, but he had to reassemble his reality. Crossroads, Christ, it had felt so real. In the dream, he had totally accepted it and why he was there. Like going to the church to worship or going to the river to fish. When you needed to make a deal with a man, you went to the crossroads, alone. He thought about Marie. She was the reason he was still there. This had been their house for the 7 years of their marriage. He lay in their bed. Harris sighed and swung his feet onto the cool floorboards. The sound of water grew louder as he walked down the hall towards the staircase, where he stood at the top of the steps, looking at water stretched evenly across his living room. His waiters, Harris realized, were in the mudroom, on the other side of the kitchen. He gritted his teeth and stepped calf-deep into cold water. He slogged across the living room, feeling bare wood alternate with rugs underfoot, followed by linoleum as he sloshed through the kitchen. Grabbing the waiters from their hook in the mudroom, he retraced his steps, leaving a trail of water up the stairs and down the hallway to the bathroom, where he dried his feet and left the dirty towel balled in the corner. It was just as well that Marie couldn't see her house now. Jeans, wool socks, and waders now on, he made his way back down to the kitchen. The house was supplied by its own propane tank, which meant their gas had not been cut off by the city. 10 minutes later, he gratefully took his first sip of coffee. He stood at the window and looked out at the swollen river and downstream at the Olson's place, empty and silent for once. The kitchen had been the heart of the house when Marie was there. She'd cooked there and fed him there, usually. She'd graded papers in the breakfast nook when she wanted to escape her office. It had smelled of garlic and bacon and coffee and cinnamon, along with other hints that he could never quite place. He'd caught a whiff of one scent in a mall a few months ago and had stood stunned, instantly transported to a place and time forever lost to him. Harris used to lean on the counter and talk with her while she fixed dinner. Her failures in the kitchen were better than his successes, and they had agreed, without discussion or gender politics, that this part of their life was best tended by her. He would do the dishes, or help her do them, by coming up behind her and reaching around her, placing his hands on her sudsy forearms as he leaned against her soft firmness, her summer dress, or winter blue jeans. It was his favorite place in the world, whether standing or spooning, arms around her, the magical landscape of her rump against him, the auburn tangles of her hair tickling his nose. That place was now 3 years gone. He mentally returned to it over and over, remembering what it felt like, exploring it like probing a broken tooth with his tongue. Harris brought himself back to the present with a sigh. He looked around him at the wreckage of the kitchen for a moment, seeing how it compared with the past, how it had stacked up even before the flood. He looked across at the Olson place and shook his head as he remembered their evacuation of the previous morning. Like everything the Olson clan did, the evacuation had been long on commotion and short on effectiveness. Harris had leaned against the counter, sipping coffee and watching the chaos unfold. Will, the youngest Olson, trudged towards their Suburban with his amp in his hands. He reached the vehicle and stared into it in dismay. "Tina, what the hell?" "What?" said his older sister as she edged through the road with an armful of clothing. "I don't even have room for my amp. You got so much crap in here." "Poor Will," said Tina, as she laid the clothes on top of the existing stack and turned back towards the house. Will reached into the back of the Suburban and took out a laundry basket piled high with clothing. He set the basket on the ground. 2 or 3 small frilly things fell out. Will heaved the amp into the vehicle. As he leaned against it to shove it into place, his back foot ground pink fabric into the mud. Tina glanced back, then froze. "You asshole. I'm putting them back once I get my amp in. Jesus Christ, chill out." "Hey," echoed their dad's voice from the front door. Dave was carrying a beer at 9:30 in the morning and had to take a cigarette out of his mouth to yell. The crisis hadn't crammed his style. "Do we have a problem here, or can we get on with dealing with the, flood?" Harris would have thought he'd have learned to filter out the noise after 10 years, but he never got used to it. He tried to feel satisfaction that they were gone. Instead, he remembered the day when Tina had talked to him after Marie died. She had pulled in as he was getting the mail. She usually just drove by. That day, though, she stopped across from his mailbox. Napoleon, her chihuahua, yammered as she shut the door, bouncing back and forth in the driver's seat. Christ, he thought, I need this shit today. Harris met Tina's eyes as she walked over, then looked down at his mail, shuffling it without seeing it. They had never had much to talk about, and the last time they had spoken, it had been 1:30 in the morning when he asked her if she could turn down her music, some sort of hip-hop crap, while her boyfriend, skinny, tattooed, and tank-topped, threw up into the bushes. She stepped closer to him than normal. He had to suppress an involuntary urge to step back. She smiled sensitively. He tried to smile back, but he was too numb. "Hey, Dave," she said, more softly than he had ever heard her speak. "Hey, Tina," he said. She studied him a moment until he looked away. She cleared her throat. We wanted to say how sorry we were about Marie. She was such a sweetie." He nodded. "Yeah." He had no idea what to say and was suddenly on the verge of crying, his jaw aching and tears hot behind his eyes. Thanks." He looked down, studying the grass at his feet. Tina smiled gently, nodded. "Okay. Let me know if there's anything we can do, all right?" She stunned him by stepping forward and embracing him. He stood awkwardly. She released him, smiled again, and walked away. Now Harris sipped his coffee and felt a little ashamed of his continual, if unspoken, judgments of the Olsons. He imagined when all was said and done, his neighbors knew how he saw them. Seen in that light, Tina's compassion towards him was remarkable. He liked to think of himself as a man of culture, keeper of the flame of knowledge and art, besieged by mass culture, weathering wave after wave of the ignorant and the loutish. But when he glimpsed himself through Tina's eyes, he was a bitter, aging man, rough edges rubbing against all around him, taking everyone's measure while his world slowly shrank, while his heart grew smaller and colder. He shook his head, too much time to think these days for sure, and poured the last of his coffee down the sink. It was time.
I just remembered another quote I came across. Some composer said, "I envy those who drink. At least they can blame their problems on something." I was like, wow. All right. Our next student reader is Elizabeth Inglesi. Elizabeth is in her final year at MPW, fiction concentration. Her guiltiest pleasure is spending all day in bed. Her favorite sin is wrath. It's the most dramatic. She's currently envious of her coworker's voluptuous calf muscles. I guess her coworker used to be a ballerina. You may not know that Elizabeth learned circus arts in her high school dance conservatory, including how to walk on a ball, which she will now demonstrate. Everybody, Elizabeth Inglesi.
Everybody, thank you so much for coming tonight. It means a lot to all of us up here. Are you having fun? Okay. This is going to be really hilarious. Yeah, those of you who know me know that was a joke. So I wasn't really as inspired by the sins and virtues as I was by our venue, so I hope you enjoy. This is a short story of mine called Ropes in White. For the past year, Mila had felt unable to recognize her own tastes, staring at a canvas and thinking first of the dryness of her lips, secondly of the names of the colors, and thirdly of moments of disappointment in kindergarten. New York's aesthetic had exhausted her. She engaged her interns. What do you see here? Where does this line take you? To their answers, she neither nodded nor frowned, and they scrutinized her blankness with terror before retreating to the filing rooms. She had never been effusive and imagined that was the quality most responsible for her success in the art world. Mila had first seen Robert Saxon's work at a gallery in New Mexico, where she had traveled out of a desire for color and roughness. The gallery hadn't been on her list. It had been near the spice shop where she had gone to have her tea leaves read. Michael liked to say her penchant for the mystical was a reaction to being overeducated. Michael went to a 2-year college that had been shut down after a gas leak killed 3 faculty and a TA. Michael wore a Cornell class ring he bought at a vintage shop, claiming he hadn't known what it was. He liked the design. The spice shop was low-ceilinged and cluttered with kachina dolls, prayer flags, sample astrological charts. It smelled of sage and woven rugs. A tan woman in a white blouse read her tea leaves and saw an umbrella, a square, an owl, and the letter H. Ominous, she said delightedly. Mila purchased a hunk of turquoise for luck and left the shop feeling empty. She was walking off her superstitious gloom when she found the gallery at the end of a quiet block, the windows orange and opaque with reflected sunlight. Its sign was printed in unfashionable typeface and tarnished by the blowing of sand. She hoped the work would be colorful and sentimental. The door of the gallery was locked. She pulled, then pushed the handle, and somehow embarrassed, backed away from it. A car drove down the street and reminded her when it passed that she was alone. Her shadow cast on the window provided her a view inside the gallery. She leaned in, put her hands to the glass, and was startled to see a man approaching her from within. She stepped back. A white-haired man opened the door. "I guess I should have unlocked that by now," he said. He wore the squinting smile of a hippie, clean denim overalls, and the face of a much younger man. Mila stepped into an unlit gallery with tarp piled in a corner and the smell of plaster in the air. The man apologized for the mess and kicked the tarps back while Mila scanned the walls. It seemed like nothing much at all. Small bits of rope, less than a foot in length each, hardened by white plaster, hung from nails in the wall. Some were straight, some knotted, some pointed to the ground, the window. Mila could not remember the last time she had wanted to touch a piece of art, but she had wanted to frequently as a student, and she wanted to now. She imagined the rough finish of the plaster, the twist of the twine, the bends and swoops. The modest shapes recalled prayer to her, prayers like she knew others to utter, prayers like she wished to have. Bless you. Mila said nothing for a long time, and from across the room the man said, "Ah, you get it." It didn't take much convincing to okay the Robert Saxon exhibition at Ferguson Gallery. Mila hadn't realized the extent of her reputation until she had championed such an unlikely artist. So many of her shows could be characterized by their size and scope, their ambition and amplitude. Sandra had initially balked at the photos Mila flicked through on her iPhone, managing only to say, as if not sure herself, "The minimalists do get publicity." The press release had been underwhelming, the intern writers not wanting to commit to any definitive statements, and Mila striking through half the text, concerned with over-dramatizing what would be a quiet, intimate affair. When the shipment arrived, Mila ordered the interns away, asking them on their way out to pull down the steel shutters. She took off her shift dress, and in her undershirt and pantyhose, sliced open the boxes. Loose plaster dusted her hands. When she lifted the first rope from its wrapping, she surprised herself with an audible sigh. It was in the early morning when she hung the last rope, zipped up her dress, and left the gallery. When Michael left, Mila realized how certainly she had expected him to. Michael had had an affair. How plucky, she said to him, and impressed, took herself to Drake's for a macchiato. It wasn't that she hadn't loved him. Of course she had. It was that she was hunting very actively for something she had already discovered he couldn't give her. She was regretful of that. Michael had a sweet demeanor. But to sink into something, wholly surrender to it, you have to be able to marvel at its mysteries. Mila could not have expected the reaction to the exhibit to be so uniform. A mockery, a joke, simple-minded, a hateful condemnation. The reviews had drawn to the opening a subversive crowd of rubberneckers, come for the smoke and flares. A woman, nearly 6 feet tall, wearing a fishnet dress and black lipstick, whose hair cockatooed up from her head in greasy spikes, nodded conspiratorially at the ropes, then at Mila. Her plate was piled with Swiss cheese cubes so high that crackers spilled from the sides. Mila closed the show an hour and a half early. Sandra waited until Monday morning to tell her about the email from the Roy Foundation. Their director of funding was demanding to know what this exhibition was intended to say to them. Mila was blank-faced. She hadn't intended to say anything to Mark, the Roy, or anyone. She had hoped they would want to touch the ropes. Walking home, Mila considered the possibility that she had been exactly wrong about Robert Saxon. She was generally less critical of art when out of the city, and New Mexico engendered a spiritual open-mindedness in her. She wondered then if she was losing her acumen. The thought was yawning. The sun in New York sets twice, first beneath the buildings and second beneath the horizon, and it was between settings, with shadow laid heavily over the streets, but bright blue blazing in the sky. Robert Saxon had agreed to the exhibition by letter, saying he didn't have an email address and that he disliked being called on the phone. He never responded to the postcards she had sent, or the letters inviting him to attend the opening. He might have been very cruel. The sun set for the second time and darkness dyed the sky. Mila stopped in Oakmart for something like miso broth, and saw her ex-husband facing a glass case of cold cuts. He looked smaller, his clothes a different color. He waited while no one came to serve him. He didn't check his number, didn't pound the counter. He stared into the meat case, waiting to be noticed. He made her itch. The checkout line was long, and though Mila had never been a shoplifter, she slipped a can of miso into her tote. She was on her way out the door when instead she found herself behind Michael. With her hand on his shoulder, he turned and blinked like his face had been splashed with water. "Mila," he said, "hi." "I'm surprised I don't see you here more often," she said, and they hugged cautiously. "Are you okay?" he asked. Mila hadn't been sleeping well or washing her hair the way she knew she should. Sometimes she forgot she was visible to other people. "I'm great," she said. "We have a marvelous new show up. Actually, there's been some controversy, which, couldn't be better for business." She remembered stupidly how Michael had been in love with her, that probably he was still in love with her and was undoubtedly reading her reviews. "That's great," he said, and she felt both grateful for his kindness and wounded by his possible obliviousness. Maybe he hadn't loved her like she had thought. That would be for the best. A man had appeared behind the counter and asked if they wanted anything. Michael said, No, that's okay." They drifted to the corner. "How have you been?" she asked, already knowing that he had found an apartment in Park Slope, picked up a new client, taken up biking. "Great," he said. "I've been good. Biking." An old Filipino couple passed between them, reshuffling them against the wall. "I wondered what your take on them would be," she said. "On what?" "On the exhibition. I've wondered what you'd think." Michael was apprehensively flattered. Rarely had Mila asked his opinion on art. They hailed a cab downtown to Ferguson. She rolled up the steel shutters, unlocked the doors to the gallery, and turned on the rows of overhead lights. The pieces looked to Mila like a humiliated lover. She felt full of pity and shame in front of them. Michael strolled along the walls with his hands clasped behind his back. He had never known what to say about art. At parties and openings, he offered unsolicited that he was from the other side of the tracks, which irked Mila with its blatant display of insecurity. Michael worked as a literary publicist, hardly blue-collar, yet he would interject at the most abrupt times with, "Don't ask the layman." He gave each group full perusal and asked, "You put this up?" A bit of neck fat bulged at the top of his collar. She had always felt tenderly toward that part of his body. She fought against her better judgment and asked, "Do you like it?" Michael tried to soften the accusation in his question with the pitch of his voice. Why do I feel tricked? I'm not looking for a right answer, but of course she was. Michael's face reddened. He held his breath and defeated, released, saying, I don't know, Lils, I don't know. Mila had never wanted to be an artist. She had been, as a child, obsessively tactile, laying her hands on smooth surfaces, brick walls, people's animals, people's clothing. It wasn't her interest to create, it was her interest to understand. She had faith in the endless lexicon of color, its expressive capacity. Unlike words, you could shade them, make them 1 degree richer or more shallow. You could push them, prod them, until you had rendered exactitude. With a brush, you could fan out meaning along a spectrum. The precise colors, layered, blended, contrasted on a canvas, whittled out the truth with their fine dimensions. Sandra enthusiastically granted Mila the week's vacation she asked for. When she landed in New Mexico, she tossed her overnight bag onto the passenger seat of her rental car and turned onto the highway, the address pinched between her knees. She drove up the serpentine stretch without passing a single structure or cross street. Half an hour up into the mesas, a small neighborhood appeared of low, flat-roofed houses and sun-bleached cactus. Another 10 minutes beyond the town, she found Robert Saxon's house, a navy blue Chevrolet in the driveway, its paint worn and flaking. Bird feeders glimmered from the porch. The screen door was torn from one corner and hanging. Mila gently knocked. From the porch, the house had an astonishing view of the valley below, red and orange sand like paints swirling down a drain. She knocked more loudly. Yeah? A man's voice asked from deep inside the house, hoarse and constricted. Mr. Saxon, this is Mila Schrader from Ferguson Art Gallery. He hadn't invited her there. He hadn't returned her letters. She was greedy. We've written a few times regarding your show. I'm a huge admirer of your work. The floorboards creaked. Can I help you with something? The voice was closer now, behind the door. She didn't know quite how to put it. She wanted to know if his work was in earnest, if he was a good person, if he believed in God. He wasn't opening the door. I don't want to take up your time. I was just intrigued by your work. I wanted to know how you felt about the pieces we exhibited, ropes in white. A thin mist of sand blew about her ankles. She tucked her arms around her waist. Her skin felt cold. He took a long time to answer. Mila saw through a window the armrest of a couch, the upholstery blown open and batting puffed out. She saw a pile of wooden blocks on a coffee table and 2 mugs, one stacked inside the other. Well, I feel a lot about them, he said, very near to her. She leaned her cheek against the door and asked no other questions.
All right. Richard A. Mathiasen is in his 2nd year final semester at MPW, nonfiction concentration. He knows the words to an alarming number of John Denver songs. His favorite deadly sin is vanity, because without a bit of vanity, you'll never survive the criticism you'll experience as a writer. His favorite cardinal virtue is fortitude, to face and defeat the constant onslaught of insecurity you'll face as a writer. Richard is jealous of anyone who's ever been in a movie with Chow Yun-fat. And you may not know that when he was in Catholic high school, he was sent to the principal's office after getting caught reading a paperback copy of Lolita. Richard Mathiasen.
Hello. This is an essay that I wrote about driving through from New York to Los Angeles in 2008. And it's called The New Yorker and the Desert. Before July of 2008, I had never seen a desert. To a man from the Northeast, the desert existed for me only in books and movies. The word conjured images of the Sahara and the Gobi, the crests and slopes of enormous sand dunes. It was Lawrence of Arabia, oases and nomadic warriors, blasted steppes and Mongol hordes. I was alone then, on a mission from New York, 4,000 miles in my Honda Civic, to a new life in California. Just me and whatever possessions I could stuff into the car. Pots and pans, the clothes that escaped the great Goodwill roundup, and a handful of books I couldn't bear to live without. It was a dizzying run through Pennsylvania and Maryland, cruising the country roads of West Virginia, through Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and now Texas, to mingle with Lone Star Patriots and 10-gallon Stetsons. I departed from Austin in the early morning after experiencing the nightlife of its too-hip-to-be-true downtown, where homeless shelters and methadone clinics stand next to indie rock venues and honky-tonk stairs reserved for outlanders. It was a long stretch on Interstate 10, nearly 6 hours to Fort Stockton, at which point I'd head north to Carlsbad and its caverns. This is where it happened. This is where the New Yorker met the desert. Desolation, sun-blasted death. Everything was brown, the ground hard and cracked where the soil could take no more and simply split, forming zigzagging chasms where snakes went to hide from the sun. After a few hours on the road, I finally hit my first ghost town. Abandoned houses, a dry goods store dead and neglected, left to crumble when the oil ran dry and the nomads moved on. The town was spent, bled dry, and left in the sun to bake and shrivel. The settlers of these pockets of past civilization must have known it was at best a temporary reprieve. The oil nomads had remembered theirs was a life on the move, that staying here was folly. Their black blood turned to dust, and on they moved in hopes of finding a new artery to tap, erect a new dry goods store and hastily constructed homes, never free from the nagging question, how long could they stay this time, and where would they go next? There were no dream houses here, merely shelters from the sun, sitting near pumps, rusted machines that sat silent and without purpose. I pulled the car over and walked the dirt roads running between the dry goods store and a few of the houses. Some windows were boarded up, but many were not, though dust and sand obscured the bits of glass still left uncracked. Fearing rattlesnakes, scorpions, and whatever other desert monsters my suburban mind could conjure, manticores, perhaps a sphinx or two, I did not venture inside. With these thoughts in my head, I returned to my car and continued west, farther and farther away from civilization as I had come to know it. A few more dead oil towns came and went, but I had seen enough. The ghosts of the desert were starting to infect me, and I was lonely. To pass the time, I imagined sharing the road with Mad Max Rockatansky, the road warrior, outrunning mutants and psychopaths in the last of the V8 interceptors, coveting fuel and finding none in these decayed hamlets. I could see for miles ahead as the road ran to a vanishing point on the horizon. On both sides laid endless rock and sand, spotted here and there with spiny flora, hard and mean, prickly and uninviting. Sparse life evolved to withstand its environment, the only kind of life that had a chance out here. Rows of barbed wire lined the road, snagged here and there with plastic bags and soda bottles, keeping either the wanderers out or whatever lay beyond in. And yet I saw no cattle, no roamers nor grazers, just barbed wire erected like a pipe dream, as if the artificial boundaries would coax a herd to its fields. It made more sense to believe the wire was for me, to keep me from growing too curious and wandering off to dehydration and death. Artifacts of past civilizations eventually began to appear in the form of dilapidated mobile homes and car park graveyards, mounds of rusted machinery, hubcaps, engines, chassis, discarded and left to dust. Who had put them there, and for what purpose? Did they have a watcher, a minder to tend them, or was it just understood that this is where old cars came to die? Was that an unspoken agreement among the nomads and the lost? Eventually, I hit Fort Stockton, where I replenished my supply of water and snacks, not knowing what chance I would have to do so on the next stretch of desert. From there, I made my way north to I-285, a 2.5-hour ride up a single lane out of Texas and into New Mexico. Again, I was the only one on the road for miles and miles, just me and the apocalypse. I saw the storm coming just over an hour before I hit it. 100 miles ahead, the clouds began to darken. They spread like black ink dropped in a glass of water, flowing outwards to cover a patch of sky impossible for me to judge at a distance. As we moved toward each other, the clouds began to expand horizontally so that they covered not only the road, but miles across in each direction. I smiled. It had been a while since I'd seen rain, and I was happy for the reprieve. The odometer ticked away the miles, and I felt the slightest tinge of nerves rattle my stomach. My undigested, not-for-Yankees barbecue lunch had awoken and was demanding to be heard. I ignored it. The clouds were darker now, with the blackness of a cosmic singularity surrounded by a corona of gray. Come on, they said. There's nowhere else to go. Our union is inevitable. Come on. Come closer. Come in. The lightning began. I was still too far to hear the thunder, but I could see the light, the glowing blue veins crackling all the way to the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2 at a time, 3. Snap, snap, snap to the earth, daring me to continue, and damned if I was going to turn around. This was not a typical storm, not to me anyway. I'd survived hurricanes, blizzards, and nor'easters. Seen cars swim down coastal streets and door-to-door rescues by rowboat. This was different. There was nowhere to seek shelter, no basement in which to cower and wait out the worst of it. Even the radio offered nothing but static. The storm and I met at last. Winds buffeted the car, swaying me to the left and to the right. Rain smashed into the hardened ground, which could not soak it in, so on the road it stayed. Newborn rivers ran to the sides, rushing furiously towards the nearest fissures before overwhelming them and moving on. The lightning struck the ground again, and now I could hear the thunder. My heart pounded like it wanted the whole world to hear it beat, answering every peal with its own dramatic reply. The windshield wipers soon became nothing more than accessories. I was blind. The whole world was rain and wind and thunder, and I was drowning on the road, alone, just me and a vengeful desert god demanding once more the respect of its subjects. Instead, I defied the desert. My car encased in rain, I hit the accelerator and sped through, watching the speedometer climb and catching the occasional glimpse of road between the droplets. It never occurred to me to slow down or pull over. I howled, I screamed, I pounded the wheel with the palm of my hand and showed the desert my war face. I laughed like a madman, demanding voice over the cacophony of the storm. And then it was over. 1 second I was driving through Satan's car wash, and the next, nothing. The rain didn't taper off, it ended. I watched the clouds slowly move on in my rear view, and no other cars were headed their way. I slowed down at last, but did not stop, though my bravado was gone, smashed by the rains and taken by the winds. The desert had tested me, enticed me with its mysteries, shown me its wrath. The desert will endure always, eroding away our footprints and our refuse until nothing but the desert remains. But for one moment, I looked it in the eyes and did not blink. From my old life to my new, I had crossed the wasteland and been humbled. Thank you.
All right. Our last student reader of the evening is Matt Ackles. Matt is in his first year in MPW, fiction concentration. His guiltiest pleasure is criticizing vegetarians. His favorite sin is lust. He's apparently looking at you, front row. And he's super jealous of people who respond to their emails in a timely fashion. You may not know how many siblings he has. He's going to have to tell us. Everybody, Matt Ackles.
Thanks so much, Niree, and thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. I'm not going to tell you how many siblings I have. It might come out in the story. I don't remember if it does, so we'll find out. This is a piece of not fiction entitled Dirty. I was halfway through the most boring chemistry class in my life when I found out I have HIV. Not to knock Dr. Davis, he was a great teacher and a kind man, but hydrogen bonds are only so interesting. It being mid-April and final exams were just far enough away to justify my lack of attention. The climate had finally warmed a bit in Cincinnati, which meant girls were wearing less clothing and I was doing less homework. My activities with these women that spring had developed in me a festering bunch of bad karma, and apparently a festering bunch of something else, which led to the phone call that interrupted that lecture. I subtly stepped out of the classroom. I was usually a more respectful pupil, but I had a love for telephone calls from unknown numbers. I always thought they were going to be a job offer from the CIA or a Hollywood agent seeking a perfect Midwestern actor who looked more real. I was still at an age when the whole world could be given to you over a cell phone. Good morning, this is Sharon from Hawksworth Blood Care. Am I speaking with Matt? To be honest, I don't remember her name. Go easy on me. It was a Wednesday morning during my freshman year of college, so I was probably hungover. Plus, I was about to get some tough news. Yes, ma'am. I loved being overly genteel early on in phone conversations. I felt like it gave me an advantage. Okay, Matt, you donated blood with us a few weeks back, and I just wanted to make sure we had your address correct. I remember her saying donating blood to us as if I gave it to the Hawksworth employees, which was not my intention at all. I was promised by a recruitment pamphlet that every time I donated, I would save 3 lives. And I kept a running tally of how many lives I've saved to date, which was 15. To be fair, that isn't why I donated. I donated because every time I got free Snackwell cream cookies and Capri Sun juice boxes, that the life-saving was a cool perk. After confirming my address, the husky black woman at Hawksworth began to cordially end the conversation. Okay, I don't know her weight or race, but she sounded husky and black. And I don't know what husk sounds like on a phone, but that's all I could come up with my wiry white imagination, so go easy. Wait, I said, trying to keep her on the line. Is something wrong? Well, and by well she meant, yep, you're probably going to die pretty soon, but it's far too early in the morning for an awkward conversation. Then, to confirm my identity, as if other people would want to steal the coming diagnosis, she asked for my social security number. At the time, I didn't know it because I thought it was cool to not know the man's number when I was in college. Sharon decided my date of birth would suffice. I guess once she knew that piece of information, we were close enough friends to drop the bomb. You've tested positive for HIV. I reacted like any hungover, slightly sheltered, precociously naive college freshman would to the news. I started laughing. She told me this was a good sign because there was a chance it had been a false positive. I was glad my reaction comforted her since she was clearly the more nervous of the conversation. After asking me to come back in for a test, she hung up relieved. Let's get a few things clear before we go forward. This was not the 1980s. I wasn't even alive in the 1980s. I grew up in a different era. I had never had a friend suffer through the virus. It didn't kill my lover or tear apart my community. HIV for my generation may as well have been polio or the bubonic plague. We all just sort of gave a sigh of relief and said, thank God we'll never get that. The worst thing AIDS ever did to me was ruin my chances of seeing a Queen reunion tour. Back in chemistry class, Josie Watson passed me a note asking if I had the night's homework written down. I wrote back saying yes. I have both the assignment and HIV. My next order of business, because now I had an HIV to-do list, was a phone call back to my dad in Texas. Ackles and Ackles Law Firm. Miss Feely always answered with a sweet southern twang. It gave you the sense that she could transfer you right to John Wayne or the Lone Ranger. Hey, Janie, it's Matt. Matt, how's it going? How's the weather in Cincinnati? She always asked, because she'd never been north of the Red River. Finally warming up. I wanted to say it was cloudy with a chance of AIDS. There was a long pause as she transferred the call. I always felt like this pause was a result of my old-fashioned father trying to operate new-fashioned technology. We couldn't get the man to use modern medicine, much less a mobile phone or the internet. If you've never had to call your father and tell him you have a wildly dangerous STD, try to avoid that situation. I don't remember a word of the ensuing conversation. I remember my dad being very calm and kind, never once acting like he thought it might be anything other than a false positive. He didn't ask if I'd done anything to get it, and since I hadn't been in a Chinese opium den or Amsterdam whorehouse recently, I didn't think I had. He told me that once I was home for the summer, I could get tested by my doctor. The next conversation on the to-do list was with my soon-to-be ex-girlfriend. Hey, so apparently I tested positive for AIDS. Biology class was even earlier than chemistry, so needless to say I hadn't learned the real distinction between HIV and AIDS. Both sounded shitty. Instead of responding, she played with the right strap of her tank top, which I understood as an invitation to defend myself. But I don't have it. False positives happen all the time. It's really no big deal. What I mean to say is, you definitely don't have AIDS. Are you sure? She asked. I'm HIV positive. The joke was poorly timed, but hey, I was the dying one. I guess it's about time that I come completely clean. I was a virgin. At the time, mind you, I was a virgin at the time. I may or may not still be, but that has nothing to do with this story, so stop thinking about it. The point is, I'd received an immaculate conception of HIV. As such, my ex-girlfriend was slightly less concerned. When the semester finally came to an end, after the longest month of my life, I packed up my dorm room and headed to the airport. My big-eyed blonde replacement for the ex, Abby, drove me down I-75 toward Covington, Kentucky, where my flight to Dallas was waiting. Before I got out of the car, she gave me a gift. Abby was sweet like that. She was a real piece of apple pie from Chattanooga, Tennessee. Inside the gift bag was a My HIV Life health kit. We both laughed, and I rubbed the hand sanitizer all over my palms. My hands burned like s'mores at a Boy Scout campfire the entire flight home. A doctor's appointment was set for the day I landed. It was easy to get a rush appointment when you have such a lethal blood disease, and when the doctor's your uncle. Ever since the day I was born, Uncle Al had taken care of me because I was family, and because he was a pediatrician. I sat in the examination room waiting for him to make his rounds, my feet dangling off a little patient table with white butcher paper draped across it. Sterile fluorescent lights glossed over the nursery rhyme-themed paintings on the wall. Little Miss Muffet sat on a tuffet, eating her curds and aids. "First HIV scare in this office, huh?" I said aloud. Peter Rabbit and Little Jack Horner looked at me awkwardly. Finally, my uncle came in. "Hey, Maddie." He talked with the calm, cordial voice of someone who explains sickness to anxious mothers all day. He didn't bother asking if I was sexually active or at risk. I clearly wasn't the most promiscuous 19-year-old ever. Not that I didn't want to be, believe me. If I had the looks or personality to be active, I would be at great risk for venereal disease. But as was, I had none of the above. "There are some things you may not be aware of," he said, "that could have put you at risk. Have you ever shaved with your roommate's razor?" One time I had a friend visit me at school, and before she jumped into the shower, she asked if she could use Tom's razor. Not thinking, he gave her permission. It was halfway through her bathing that we both remembered girls don't grow facial beards, and by then, it was far too late. I would never, ever use Tom's razor. "No," I answered my uncle. By the time I left his office, my uncle had swabbed my throat or ripped out a swatch of my hair or something to test for the virus. He said it was just a preliminary test. At this point, all my friends in Dallas had gotten on the HIV bandwagon. Becky loved the story about the husky black lady. Leslie thought it was cool to have a disabled friend. Rob and Michael were so excited they want to sign me up for an HIV dating website. They always looked on the bright side, because that was the only side any of us had ever seen. "Dude, you're going to be such a catch in the AIDS community. Yeah, man, you're so clean cut. Most straight guys with the HIV are gross druggies. Dude, you're like a 6 now, but in the AIDS world, you'd be at least an 8. See what I mean about my generation? It was like I'd collected a novelty baseball card from the 70s. But something about the HIV dating community and my friends' excitement made me scared for the first time. I knew I didn't have HIV. I wasn't worried, but when I thought about dating other people with the virus as if that would be safe, it all started to make my stomach feel empty. I wanted to trade this newly acquired Cal Ripken Jr. rookie card for my normal, naive life. My dad called me from work the next day while I was still in bed. "Hey, son, I just got a call from Uncle Al." I liked how Dad still called him Uncle, as if I was a toddler and didn't realize his name was simply Al. I didn't like that Al had phoned my dad instead of me, because I knew this meant bad news. I had tested positive again. All that was left to confirm the diagnosis was a full-scale blood test. They would freeze my blood sample, open up the white blood cells, and extract the DNA to see if it was being replicated by the HIV retrovirus. I had recently started paying a bit more attention to biology. On the way to the testing lab, I called Rob to tell him it was all a mistake. He responded by reading me a news article about a man in Utah who contracted HIV from the needle at a blood bank. Getting my blood drawn was nowhere near as fun this time around. There were no cookies or juice boxes. I wasn't saving any lives. Lying on a sterile gurney in that clinic, I felt like a ghost. I could feel myself thinning out. I knew, for the first time, that I had HIV. But I couldn't decide if I liked that or not. There were pros and cons. I thought maybe, if we had good health insurance, I could fight it long enough to become everyone's hero. I didn't like that people would be afraid to touch me, which is how I felt when I would encounter an HIV character, since I couldn't fight the feeling that they were dirty. I wouldn't be able to ever lose my virginity, but I probably wasn't going to do that anyway, and now I had a noble excuse. I rested on that gurney, letting the dark side of my thoughts enjoy the moment. I always secretly wanted something really bad to happen to me, like barely surviving a car wreck, or having my whole family die in a plane crash. I wanted to have that moment of despair I always loved in movies. I would get in my car after they were pronounced dead and apathetically pay the parking fee at St. Paul's Hospital. I would drive through the night, crying but stiff as a stone, tears just falling out of open eyes. I wouldn't know where I was going, but I'd end up at the park by my house, swinging on a swing set back and forth. Someone would walk up to me, a really cute girl I was always friends with or something, and we'd exchange the most powerful raw dialogue we could muster. At the end of all these scenarios, I was always the hero, always the strong one who survived. As the blood drained out of my body into a test tube, I realized I was going to be the one to die. 3 weeks later, I was playing basketball in my backyard, because that's what you do when the end is close, when my mom came outside and said Uncle Al had stopped by. By the time he sat me down in the front room, a white carpeted room we never used because it was far too nice for a family with 4 boys, I had already known the diagnosis. We did 2 tests, he said, calming and cordial. The first was an antibody test to check to see if there were any antibodies my body had produced. As a recent HIV buff, I knew that there are 12 antibodies the body creates to fight the virus. If a person had produced 3 of them, it was a sure sign they were infected. You have 9 of them. He was showing me a confusing lab report with a bunch of checks and very few X marks. So we did the second test. This entailed the actual analysis of my DNA. I always knew I had DNA, but who really thinks about a bunch of DNA floating around inside of them? I always felt more like the greater whole than the sum of the parts. Now the parts were broken. Al looked at me for a moment. There are no viruses replicating. You do not have HIV. I didn't know what to do. I laughed when I heard the bad news, but the good news made me quiet. The first tests were false positives, he said. You must have had some other meaningless virus which tripped the alarm. Are you sure? I asked. HIV positive. All right, he didn't say that, but that's the way I like to remember it. He did hold up his hand, offering the most excited high five of my newly rejuvenated life. I went back outside to play basketball, because that's what you do when your whole life is ahead of you. A few months later, doctors in Germany used the blood of a man who was immune to HIV as a cure for an infected patient. I'm not claiming to be a scientist, but according to my doctor uncle, it is possible that I'm immune to the human immunovirus. What I'm trying to tell you is that I'm the cure for AIDS. I haven't donated blood or had it tested since, so I can't prove anything for sure, but I just know it down in my bones. I'm pretty sure I'll live forever. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever been more stressed out. Oh my God. All right. So that was it for our student readers of the evening. Round of applause for them. Now for our faculty reader. Judith Freeman is primarily a self-taught writer. She was initially inspired by a literature class she took while briefly enrolled at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. She learned to write by reading and studying the writers she admired. She considers herself primarily a fiction writer, though she's written many essays and reviews and 1 nonfiction book. Her first book was a collection of short stories published by Viking Press, followed by 4 novels. She received a Guggenheim Fellowship in Fiction in 1996. Her most recent book is the nonfiction work The Long Embrace, Raymond Chandler and the Woman He Loved, named by Newsweek as one of the 10 best books published in 2007. She recently received the Earl Stanley Gardner Fellowship in Mystery Studies from the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas in Austin to do research there for a new book about jazz and noir. She's taught in the MPW program for 10 years and has met many wonderful students, some of whom are here to read with her tonight. Her guiltiest pleasure is the occasional cigarette. She's had 1 so far this year. If you'd like to know what Judith's favorite sins and virtues are, she's letting her husband answer that. She's sure he'll be happy to speak to you after the reading. The silliest or strangest thing Judith is jealous of is that Toni Morrison got the Nobel Prize and she didn't. I'm jealous of that too. You may not know that she starred in her high school play, The Diary of Anne Frank, playing Anne Frank, even though the drama teacher, Portia Douglas, thought she was too plump for the role. Playing Anne Frank was the moment when she realized the true power of words to move an audience. It was also the moment when it first occurred to her she might want to become a writer. Ladies and gentlemen, Judith Freeman.
Well, it's terrific to be with these students tonight, a number of whom I've had in my classes or for thesis advisement, and they were all just terrific. So I'm so happy to be here. I'm going to read tonight from my first novel, since so many of my students are working on their first novel, or a collection of short stories. So this book was published 23 years ago. It's sort of hard to think about that now, but it's a book I'm still really fond of. I haven't read from it in a long time. So this is a story of Verna Flake, whose husband leaves her for a younger woman. I wonder if a husband ever leaves a wife for an older woman. I don't think so. Verna decides to leave Utah in the small town where she was born and to light out for California, for Los Angeles, where she has a friend. And as she leaves Utah, she picks up a hitchhiker on the road, a kind of down-and-out character. Oh, thank you. A sort of down-and-out character named Duluth Wing. So here's Verna on the road with Duluth. They're driving toward Los Angeles. The road ran straight into the desert, down one side of a wide valley and up the other side. We passed two big factories of some sort, set out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but sand around them. I couldn't decide what kind of factories they were. Cement plants, chemical, some kind of mineral processing, maybe bauxite or gypsum. Boxcars stood idle on the rail line next to the buildings. Whatever was produced there was taken away by train. We were miles from any houses, climbing a long, slow hill way out on the other side of Las Vegas. There were cars parked near some low buildings out by the factories. Did people drive out there every day? Where did they live? I pointed out the factory or plant or whatever it was to Duluth. What do people do out there, do you think? Duluth said, masturbate a lot, probably. I didn't like it that he'd said this. It seemed coarse and dirty to me. I was quiet for a while. It smells like rain, he said suddenly. Either that or the radiator is starting to boil over on your engine. It wasn't rain. I looked down at the temperature gauge and realized we were in the red. That's no good, I said. I pulled over and stopped on the shoulder of the road. We have to wait for it to cool down. Duluth brushed the front of his shirt as if there were crumbs there. At least it's not too hot out here this time of year, he said. We could dry up like dog turds out here if it was hot. I hate this wind, I said. Wind can make you crazier faster than anything else. I think I'll take a little walk. I'll be here. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. I got out and began walking between the sparse, brittle brush into the sandy desert toward the base of some mountains. The land formed sloping bowls, so the earth tilted toward the mountains in all directions. The mountains here were the color of dried mud, and it didn't look like one thing grew on them. The wind blew hard against my face as I climbed. Sometimes as a child, I'd be driving with my parents towards Snowflake, Arizona, where my grandmother lived, crossing through one of those endless desert valleys that crisscross the West, and I'd look out at the unbelievably dry and hot-looking earth and think, we'll die out here if this car breaks down. Of course, there were other cars on the road. We wouldn't have been left unattended. Someone would have stopped to offer us help. But still, I had these fantasies. I saw us taking a little side trip. It wasn't beyond my father to suggest something like this. I saw us turning off the highway onto one of those little dusty roads that were used by ranchers to check on sheep or cattle in the distant hills. Just 2 tire tracks, pale and hardly worn. I imagined us driving out into the desert, sagebrush scraping our car, dust rising behind us, the whole family, all 8 kids, bouncing on our seats. Hours later in this fantasy of mine, we break down. The car refuses to go. I imagine us marooned in the incredible stillness of the desert, the sun beating down. At first we're optimistic. We settle ourselves in the shade of the car. Mom gets out the green metal jug with the little silver spigot and runs lemonade into paper cups. She sings to us. Dad tinkers with the engine. We hunt for horned toads. But the heat starts to really get to us. Hours pass, and we begin to see there's very little hope. We'll be rescued that day. Buzzards begin circling. Night comes, and the temperature drops. The coyotes howl a few feet away. We hear rattlesnakes where there really aren't any. Day breaks. The sun comes up and becomes increasingly merciless. Another day passes, and we're weak, all of us. Our water runs out, and there's nothing to do but face the end. Naturally, we pray, and we think about the relatives that are waiting for us on the other side. Luckily, we belong to a religion that promises this won't be the end. So we face death with courage, saying family prayers. Later, a rancher finds the bones, 2 adults, male and female, and 8 little skeletons of ascending size. It always seemed to me my family was close to such perilous situations. How could we have been so foolish as to stand on a bridge above the Colorado River, where a sudden gust of wind might have pitched us over the railing? Why did my father let us ride in a rickety homemade trailer when we went out to work on our property in Layton, or stand on the running board of the truck while he backed up? Did he really mean to endanger us when he drove close to the edge of cliffs like he often did? Or was he just kidding, the way he pretended? And how could we have trusted a mere automobile to carry us across the vast and unpopulated deserts? Now that I thought about it, our lives were so awfully ordinary, so cushioned and plain and secure, without any real threat encroaching on our daily rounds, that I must have longed for the danger and excitement a real accident might bring. Once on the road to Snowflake, we did have an accident, a real crash, while my mother was at the wheel. She hit a couple from Wisconsin broadside. They were driving a Lincoln Continental and towing a little Airstream trailer, and without looking, they pulled out onto the highway right in front of our car. I was lying on the back seat with my father. When my mother hit the brakes, Dad and I slid from the seat and landed on James and Farley, who were sitting on the floor. There was so much damage to both cars they had to be towed away from the site of the accident, but amazingly no one was hurt. It meant, however, that we had to stay in a motel in Tuba City for 3 nights until our car was fixed. It was one of those motels in a U-shape that had a little carport for each room. Years later, I drove through Tuba City and noticed the motel was still there, only now badly run down, the carports clogged with weeds. The couple from Wisconsin, Midge and Art Whipple, stayed in the same motel, waiting for their own car to be repaired. They weren't members of the church, and my mother saw an opportunity. It gave her a chance to demonstrate the good qualities of Mormons to some outsiders. Qualities like friendliness, for instance, and forgiveness. Even though the accident had been the Whipples' fault, Mom went out of her way to reassure them it could happen to anybody. The important thing was that we were all okay. Furthermore, she demonstrated her tolerance by telling Mitch Whipple that it was okay to smoke in my parents' motel room when the Whipples visited. My mother had never allowed anybody to smoke in a room where she was. I'd seen her ask people to go out on the lawn to have a cigarette. And finally, as if to prove that Mormons weren't as straight-laced as people thought, Mom told one of her jokes. My mom's jokes were always about the same thing. They were harmless little off-colored stories that she told with verve. When she told the Whipples one of her jokes, we were sitting outside our motel room in the faltering desert light. The rest of the kids were exploring the streets of Tuba City. I was left with the adults, who seemed somehow to forget that I was there. They sat on metal patio chairs with backs that were fluted like seashells. I sat on the grass, which was full, I remember, of clover. Mom started out by saying she'd heard a story the other day. She really shouldn't tell it, but, well, oh, go on, Mitch Whipple said. Mom leaned forward slightly in her chair. This couple gets married, you see, and goes on their honeymoon. It was amazing to me how many of my mother's stories started this way. Marge, my father said, you're not going to tell that one. Good hell. Oh, it's not so bad. I've got worse, Mom said. Oh, go on, Midge Whipple said again. She and Mom had begun some female complicity in this thing now. So it's their wedding night, Mom says, and the fellow begins to undress. First he takes off his shoes, and his wife sees that he has the worst-looking feet, especially his toes. They're all misshapen and deformed, and she says, good heavens, what happened to your toes? This one kind of drags on, Dad said to the Whipples. Don't crap out. She'll get to the punchline before long. The fellow says to his wife, oh, my toes look like this because I had polio when I was a kid. The wife says, don't you mean polio? No, he said, it was tolio. She thinks it's kind of funny, but she doesn't say anything, and then the fellow takes off his trousers, and she looks at his knees. We're working our way up here, Dad said, in another aside to the Whipples. You can kind of guess where we're headed. This fellow's got terribly deformed knees, all scarred and ugly. She says, well, what happened to your knees? He says, oh, I had measles when I was young. Measles? Don't you mean measles? She says. No, he said, it was measles. She didn't quite know what to think. Then he takes off his, all his clothes, and she takes one look at him and says, don't tell me, let me guess. You had smallpox, too, right? The Whipples really laughed at Mom's joke. But nobody ever laughed harder at a joke, her own or somebody else's, than my mom. She laughed till she made little buck snorts and sometimes opened her mouth so wide she showed her gold teeth. My mom could put anybody in a good mood. Her humor is unstoppable. She could convince anybody that Mormons aren't straight-laced. And yet, she never fails to think of herself as a representative of her people, first of all, and above everything else, a Latter-day Saint. I could tell what was coming, what happened next. They sat there a while longer out in front of the Bide a While motel, looking down the main street of Tuba City, commenting on small things. And then Mom said to the Whipples, do you have any interest in investigating the church? Why? What did they do? Our Whipples said. My dad laughed. No, I mean in learning more about it. The Whipples looked suddenly uncomfortable. Midge said, sure, although we're Catholics, Oh, my mother said, undeterred, well, that's nice. That's interesting. Although it really wasn't that interesting to her. It was just some kind of misconception that needed to be dislodged. And then she simply began by saying Mormons believe that their church is the true church of Jesus Christ, restored here upon earth in these latter days, and started telling them the story of the boy Joseph Smith, who was visited by angels when he was 12 years old, and directed to the hill Cumorah, where he found golden tablets buried in a box. I left at this point, because I'd certainly heard that story. And I walked to the rear of the motel, where the desert seemed to start exactly at the edge of the blacktop, and large tanks marked propane were lying in rows and appeared peculiarly white in the sun. And I looked out toward a row of purple and red hills, wondering if there were any wild horses out there, wishing I could get one for free. Duluth hadn't moved. I could see his head was motionless, resting against the door jamb. He looked pretty small, sitting in the blue truck with the copper-colored horse trailer attached to it. I thought he was sleeping. He was so still. Then suddenly he put a hand out the window and waved at me, and I waved back. And I realized he'd been watching me all this time. I started walking back toward the truck and trailer. The desert had a thin, dry crust over it that broke with each step. A little rabbit turd looked like pure silver in the light. I had walked quite a ways all uphill, and now it felt nice to be swinging my arms and coming down fast, stretching out my limbs. "How's it going?" Duluth said as I came toward him. "Okay." I got in and turned the key. The engine was still too hot to drive away, so we sat there. "I've been thinking about my little girl," he said. "The one that's living with my ex-wife." "How old is she?" 3. Yep, just 3. She's a tiger." "You don't have a picture?" "No, I don't. I guess I should. That's what I'll do. I'll write her mother and ask her for a picture." "Where does her mother live?" "Orem," he said. Boy, is that a depressing place. I kept saying to Melanie, that's my ex-wife, "What are you doing here?" Her husband is a muffler salesman for Midas. He got her to move with him back to Utah, back to his hometown. "I bet you miss your daughter." "You can say that. I miss her mother, too. I miss everything about the life we had and we're not ever going to have again, and I can't see Macon with anybody else." He looked out the window. "I don't see much of a future for myself anymore, to tell you the truth." You can't say anything to anybody when they tell you something like that. You can't say, "I'm sorry," or "That's too bad," or "I'm sure everything will be okay." I can tell you the precise moment when things went wrong, when I knew we were in trouble, he said. It happened at a party in Los Angeles. Some people she worked with at the phone company had asked us over. I didn't really know them. There was this guy there named Stu. Melanie, my wife, started flirting with him from the moment we arrived. She was being pretty outrageous, you know. I mean, really laying it on thick. And he was the kind of guy who can get a woman to do that very easily. A southerner with a big-time drawl. Ham jowls, I called him. But that was later, when I gave him that name. That night I didn't know anything about him, except he was coming on to my wife, looking her up and down. They were drinking, we all were, getting loose fast, and some people were doing drugs too. There was a lot of dancing around. I looked over one time and noticed Stu sitting close to her, holding a cigarette up in his hand. She had on a blouse that dipped in front, giving him something to look at. And then something happened. He began undoing her blouse, one button at a time, when a piece of ash dropped from his cigarette and fell down her blouse. She didn't even try to get it out. She just started screaming, "Duluth! Duluth!" And in a second I was across the room. I took hold of him from behind, putting my hands around his neck, and I said to him, "I always come when I'm called." Then I turned him loose. And that was that. He left pretty quickly. Later, when we were in the car on the way home, I said to Melanie, "Do you have to make every man in the room get a hard-on?" "Well, it does cheer him up," she said. And I knew that was what she would be doing from then on, cheering men up. He rested his head back against the window. "Don't you think it's cooled down enough for us to be on our way now?" "Probably," I said. "It's not that I'm rushing you," he said. "I'd just like to be home before dark." Thank you.
Readers. This concludes our reading event of the evening. Special thank you to the faculty and everybody for showing up, and for Judith for reading. Thank you to LACMA and Jose for helping me put this together and for graciously hosting us, and to Corey, who's recording for the YouTube page, so look for that link. And the last reading of the year will be April 27th at the Barnes & Nobles at the Grove, Greed and Charity, featuring Mark Richard. So I hope to see you all there. Have a good night.